Ahoy! Joe Buddy Hambone here, and I'm back again with a brand new coupon code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. That code is VRPG21, and it is good from February the 15th all the way through March 31st, and it's good for 10% off any size order. You heard me right, Noble Knight is back bringing the heat with 10% off any size order, good from the 15th of February all the way through March 31st. Never been a better time than now to pick up some games. And hey, if you got some older games that you need to clear out to make space for those new games, Noble Knight's got you covered with a killer trading program. You can learn more about that at nobleknight.com. And in the meantime, don't forget, if you're shopping at Noble Knight, to use our code VRPG21 to get 10% off any size order from February 15th through the 31st of March from our friends over at Noble Knight Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the editor-in-chief of Unwinnable.com. He had to check Libsyn multiple times to make sure that we didn't do this one already, Stu Horvath.
It's true. I can't believe that we didn't do this. This is weird. Like, how do we skip this?
Occasionally, we do skip something, like the BX episode. You're like, well, how didn't we not talk about BX already? Because we didn't, because we've done 107 episodes, and there's been a lot of other quality stuff to talk about.
Yeah. It's just a wide field of potential.
It really is.
That also seems like it's been done. I don't know. It's weird.
I mean, we did the Monster Manual, too, as the pilot.
Yeah.
We did the Monster Manual.
Yeah.
So now we are going to talk about Fiend Folio.
Yes.
Which is the first monster book that I ever got for Dungeons and Dragons. When I got into the game, I didn't get the Monster Manual. I got the Fiend Folio because it's called the Fiend Folio. And there is a cool looking monster on the front of it with a big old sword. And I was just like, well, I guess this is the one you buy, right? Never regretted that purchase for a second.
I agree. I've just learned a lot about Fiend Folio in the last 24 hours, and it's funny that we have a podcast that I can immediately share that with.
How serendipitous.
Yeah. It's like I have no control over the schedule. So Fiend Folio comes out in 1981, right? It's the follow-up. It's like the sequel to Monster Manual. It's another monster book. It doesn't really break much new ground, but, you know, it's a monster book. People love monsters and books.
I love monsters.
And you put monsters in books, and I'm going to buy it. But interesting thing is, it was supposed to come out in 1979.
Really?
Yeah. There's so much information about TSR and stuff from the early days. If you just read the forwards in all of the books, it's right there. I've never read the forwards before I started working on my book. So there's all these things right there in the forward. It says 1979. So immediately I'm just like, why did he write the forward 2 years ago before the book comes out?
Or why didn't they just change it to like 1981 when they released it?
Well, I mean, there's that too. I mean, the early days of TSR, they weren't very good at editing. Even when they updated, like in 1983, when they went to the orange spines, they didn't change any of the copyright information in the back. So like people will get those orange spine books like and try and sell them on eBay saying that it's like a first edition. It's like, no, it was not printed in 1977. I'm sorry. It's an orange spine. That's 83 and on. Like there's all these oversights because they didn't really know what they were doing. They weren't like a real publishing house.
Until they became a publishing powerhouse.
Exactly. So Fiend Folio is not really a TSR product. It's born out of a series of articles in the first, year's worth of Games Workshop's magazine, White Dwarf, called Fiend Factory. So these were user-submitted monsters for Dungeons and Dragons that they ran in the magazine. Games Workshop, of course, at that point, in the late 70s, was basically the de facto distribution arm for TSR in the UK. It was too expensive to import D&D books from TSR. So they got the equivalent of the files and printed their own copies or just did the importing themselves and sold it to the UK market. So the idea was that Games Workshop would put together this collection of monsters and they would publish it. But the relationship between Games Workshop and TSR was getting so close and they worked so well that there was talk of merging.
Really?
In 79, yeah. but the whole thing falls apart. So what TSR wants to do is found their own office, which they do in 1981, called TSR UK. But what Games Workshop doesn't want to do is have like any part of this anymore, because like they basically have to publish a book that TSR is going to use to launch their competing office.
It was cooler when you were my summer girlfriend I met at camp and you really live in Canada or the UK, but now that you want to move to my neighborhood, we can't be in love anymore.
You know, it's kind of amazing too, because like TSR, I mean, people used to joke that TSR stood for they sue regularly. Like they were a nasty company in terms of business practice. I know, it's hilarious. I wish that there was like a lawsuit joke that you could make with Games Workshop's initials, because they also sue regularly. This sort of clash between two giants, two kind of ugly, brutish giants in the early days of the hobby is kind of amazing. There's sort of like a rich poetic justice that they were both kind of trying to screw each other over. So basically, the reason why it took so long for Fiend Folio to come out is because Games Workshop basically slow walked it for 2 years until they couldn't delay anymore, and then gave the manuscript to TSR, and TSR put it out as a TSR product. And when they did that, they included some classic D&D monsters that had appeared in modules up to that point. So you get the Drow, you get the Kuatoa, maybe that's it. Germalain, I think, are D&D monsters and not Games Workshop monsters. And there's a clear contrast, I think, in the stuff that was made by TSR, the stuff that Games Workshop made, because it was like reader submitted stuff. I feel like Fiend Folio is like kind of a mixed bag. There's awesome stuff in there. The Grell, the Githyanki, but there's also like the Flumph. There's like a million skeleton undead that are just like skeleton undead. There's nothing really to distinguish the Kuva from the Coffer corpse, like, do you even remember those two monsters? I mean, you'll probably remember the illustrations because Russ Nicholson did them, but like details of those monsters, no.
One thing I'll never forget from the Fiend Folio is Crabman. Because how could you forget Crabman when it has next to the entry on page 21 a full-size picture on page 20 of the Crabman, which looks like a cross between the Great Gonzo and Clawful from He-Man and other crab men, if you will, going sick house on a bunch of adventurers with a wizard in the middle being like, they're not my friends. Like, that was the kind of thing that you got in the Fiend Folio that I always thought stood out to me versus, say, like the Monster Manual, the Monster Manual 2, because I'm sure that there were definitely, and maybe like, looking at it from the future back to the past, cooler monsters that they could have incorporated, or other amazing Russ Nicholson creatures that would have been like better suited for that full page than Crabman. But hey, man, Crabman got a featured spot.
I mean, those two full-page Russ Nicholson illustrations, the Grell battle and the battle against the Githyanki, in 1981, two easily, hands down, like the best D&D art to date. Those two illustrations, and then you have Crabman. It's like, what? And like so many of the monsters in there are like that. I mean, Kenku becomes sort of a thing that's fun, but it's like, oh, well, it's a bird and it's a man. There you go. You got a new monster. Lots of like kind of needless riffs on existing monsters. Like the Norker is a tougher kind of hobgoblin, or the Ogrillion, or however you pronounce it, is just a cross between an ogre and an orc. It's like, come on. I mean, I love Flins, whatever, but they're just like, gnolls on steroids.
You do get the flail snail, though.
Flail snails are awesome.
They are pretty cool, man. Yeah, I'm not going to front that. Like, I'm not really into the flail snail, but when you look at it against other creatures, like the Eye of Fear and Flame, there is definitely a disparity between the level of awesomeness of these monsters and the Flump.
Yeah, totally. And it's that mixed bag thing. The awesome is awesome, and then like there's probably monsters in there that if you look through it carefully, you'd be surprised are in there and that they are that dumb. Like the Adherer. It looks like a mummy, except it's covered in glue. Like, what?
Yeah.
Why would there be an animal that looks like a man with wrinkly skin that looks like bandages that has stuff stick to it? I don't understand. That's just some like sitting at the lunch table making up monsters in middle school kind of shit, you know?
Well, that's what a lot of the art in this book looks like. It looks like dudes who are definitely failing algebra, drawing some sick monsters. And that's one of the things I love and I appreciate about the Fiend Folio so much, more than most other monster books ever released.
Well, I think it's a good deal weirder too because of the crowdsourcing. I think that the Githyanki are weird. They hang out on the astral plane and like they have swords and they cut the silver cords. Like, what is going on? Like, I don't understand any of that. That's sort of trippy, man. And it comes out of sort of like that Hawkwindy kind of like Prague thing that's going on in England. That's why you get Elric and stuff. Like Michael Moorcock was doing a lot of drugs in England.
That
And
makes
that's
total sense.
like the Burbalang is like constantly astrally projecting. Like there's a lot of trippy stuff in the Fiend Folio if you look for it. And I think that kind of paves the way, like not explicitly for a reason I'll get into in a minute, but I feel like Fiend Folio is your stepping stone to like Spelljammer and Planescape, the weird undercurrent. It starts sort of with Fiend Folio because there's just so much far out stuff. And both of those settings feature Githyanki to some degree.
It makes total sense to me because as I'm looking through this book, I'm thinking to myself, people who drew this book have definitely done some drugs.
Totally. So I'm going to blow your mind. Fiend Folio, not really well received when it came out.
You don't say.
Yeah, like people didn't know what to make of it. Ed Greenwood writes the review. Yeah, Ed Greenwood, who made the Forgotten Realms, writes the review for Dragon Magazine. It's like 4 pages of disappointment in Dragon Magazine.
Wow.
Like,
He
right?
dragged them in Dragon?
Yep. Dragon and Dragon. Nobody really liked it. Ed Greenwood felt that it marred the beauty of Dungeons and Dragons. Like it diminished the consistency, the beautiful consistency of the game, which is just like, whoa, what, really? You're going that hard on like a monster book filled with Russ Nicholson art?
I mean, how do you not fall in love with Russ Nicholson when you read the Fiend Folio?
I don't know. I think that like pound for pound, I think that the Fiend Folio, like at that moment, is the best looking D&D book. Another thing I'm going to blow your mind with, Russ Nicholson didn't do the cover art.
Really?
Yeah, it's another artist named Emmanuel.
Just the first name, or
Yeah,
just
like
one name?
Cher. Yeah.
I mean, that's cool. Listen, if you can get it over where you can just get by with just having one name, props to you.
Yeah, I was really kind of thrown by that because I just always, because Russ does the interior Githyanki, I just figured that I never thought about it. I never looked at the credits because why would I? This book that I've had for 30 years. And yeah, and so like I feel like that's a little jarring thing. Another thing that's going to blow your mind, a thing that is like right there on your shelf looking at you, but you just never realize it. In 1983, when they started doing the Orange Spine books, they did not reprint Fiend Folio. It's the only one of the 5 wraparound cover books that didn't get a reprint with an orange spine.
Holy shit. You're right.
And I think that speaks to the level of disavowal that TSR felt for the book.
That's petty.
Yeah, right?
I mean, that's petty from a company that has a creature called Tween. Not even kidding, folks. Page 91. It's in the book.
Think about how much they must have disliked that, because this is the monster manual that has the drow in it. And the drow are kind of the monster that make the company. They build the 90s around the drow. To dislike the Fiend Folio, to never reissue it again, that's sort of a bold amount of dislike.
Yeah. You know, it's funny, the books that they continue to keep on the shelves, yet the Fiend Folio is one that just like, it's our weird cousin from across the pond. We don't invite him to Thanksgiving.
Yeah. And because of that, now this is totally anecdotal. I have no idea, and I don't talk to people, so I have no idea what their experiences are. But feel free if what I'm about to say lines up with your experiences, drop us a line. Let us know. I'd love to hear more. In 81, you have a little bit of the satanic panic stuff going on, this ridiculous moral panic about like the dangers of Dungeons and Dragons. And that echoes through the whole of the 80s and continues to a certain degree up until the 90s, because, you know, there's this idea that when second edition comes out, they remove the devils and demons to like not run afoul of these upset moms, right? And because they never reissued Fiend Folio, I had this notion that like I had no idea about the business stuff. The fact that this was sort of like a illegitimate child, like a bastard son that they didn't want anything to do with. I felt that like it must be the Satanic Panic, right? There must be something evil about that book. It infused it with like a little bit of that forbidden energy that makes first edition stuff so cool in like a pop culture zeitgeisty kind of way.
I love it.
Yeah. And I feel like when TSR knuckled in the 90s and made the monstrous compendium that was named Fiend Folio, I felt like that was like a victory for cool people over like jerks, because like they were releasing the monsters that they thought that they shouldn't release, that were dangerous somehow because it's stupid.
Hey man, take the win any way you can get it.
Yeah, and that might have just been me and like my group and like the comic book store guys who are a little bit older than us. Like it might just be something that we kind of constructed, but I am kind of curious if that is the perception. I have a feeling that it might be, because there's like that, because the book itself, when you get it, like that Nicholson art, like it's gnarlier, right?
It's dangerous. And that's something we
Yeah.
always talk about in regards to like first edition, second edition, stuff like that. Like it was dangerous. I mean, they came up with this Satanic Panic for a reason. And like when you look at some of these monsters, you look at some of this art, you're just like, yeah, there was just a vibe and an energy that is not going to really ever be captured again. I mean, granted, shout out to all the people making zines over the last several years. Some really amazing stuff. I mean, it's taken things like Morkborg to make something polished look dangerous again. And
Yeah.
that was no small feat, because as we know, Dungeons and Dragons as an intellectual property has become this is what D&D looks like.
Yeah.
And it is done by fantastic artists. However, it still has a very defined look. There is synergy across all ends of Dungeons and Dragons as we know it now. Whereas it really was the Old West back then, and there was that real dangerous, like up until like second edition really came out, and really, you had the model sheet looking
Yeah.
monsters. It was very like, all right, this is like something that when you threw it out in front of your friends, you were just like, oh my God, that monster is sick. Like you would use words like sick to describe monsters back then. And I think that a good amount of energy like that has not been around in RPGs for a very long time, comparatively to now, where, you have a lot of people doing zines again. You have a lot of people creating their own books and stories and not really worrying about like how it's going to look really in the long run per se, because they're just trying to put out this amazing creation that they have right now. It's like this energy that they need to purge from their bodies. And that spirit, to me, really does harken back to the kind of art and output you were seeing back in the day with the Fiend Folio, and now is translated on a very cool looking scale to things like Morkborg, which I think is awesome. So this is still my favorite monster book, hands down, all time. It is the GOAT. The best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be, done with love by people like Russ Nicholson and other amazing artists.
Yeah, like the Burbalang is like totally disemboweling a dude in one of those pages.
I know.
It's like, what? It's so heavy metal, like so heavy metal. And it's been pointed out to me that one of the key differences between the early D&D stuff and the modern 5th edition stuff is that you never see characters really hard pressed in the art of 5th edition. They're always triumphant sort of superhero, kind of almost like propaganda posters. Whereas the real charm of the monster manuals from 1st edition is that like dudes are getting eaten up.
Yes,
Like,
they are.
like the Bone Snapper is like eating a dude like head first, like a Harryhausen movie. And it's gnarly and gritty and weird in terms of like depictions of violence. I don't think that there's a match for Fiend Folio until you get maybe in some of the latter second edition stuff, right after Wizards of the Coast has bought TSR and they started thumbing their nose at all the rules that TSR had kind of like shoved down the throats of the designers in sort of like a comics code kind of way. Book of Vile Darkness for 3E is probably the only like kind of really dark, and that maybe even goes farther than Fiend Folio, but like there's only a handful of these things that are that kind of like you get a hint of that in the player's handbook, but there's nothing in the player's handbook that supports it. There's plenty in Fiend Folio that is kind of like a little transgressive for a game that's being played by kids.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, for me, I still look back fondly on a lot of these things, especially because like my edition of the Fiend Folio, I have a 1981 edition. It's in pretty pristine shape for a book that's old. You know, the thing that really stands out on it is on the very front cover, there is a Toys R Us sticker. So it was $8.99 when this was originally on sale. The spine's in great shape. Everything's in great shape, especially when you get to the back. There is an epilogue that explains why it didn't come out when it was supposed to come out and that it came out in 1981. And then there's also an advertisement in the back of the book with a line where you should cut it out. That's the D&D Players Association. If you want to join the D&D PA, here's how you do it. Here's an ad for Gen Con, right? Then you also have a send away. It's a survey, like with the line dashed for you to cut it out. Like they were like, oh, hey, you just spent all this money on a book. Yeah, make sure that you cut out this business reply mail, no postage necessary survey for us so we know what we're going to do and how we could do our jobs better as a hobby company. So it's amazing to me that back in the day, they were like, well, how are we going to do our market research? Well, we're going to make you defile a book you just spent your hard-earned money on to send us something. Awesome. So, Stu, do you have any final thoughts on the Fiend Folio?
You know, I do. I almost forgot, but I feel like this Fiend Folio gives you kind of a preview, a glimpse into the future of what Games Workshop is really going to sort of lean into. Like the Russ Nicholson art kind of sets the tone for all the Warhammer stuff. You know, it was sort of already established a little bit with Ian Miller's art for Lord of the Rings and the 2000 AD comics. There's sort of an established British fantasy aesthetic that you'll later see, you know, stuff like Vertigo Comics kind of come out of too, that leans into like the dark and the gritty but also kind of like weirdly gooeyly humorous too, that you see in the early Warhammer fantasy role play. But yeah, like I feel like all of this is like a real kind of glimpse into it's like a hint of things that will come. And I think that's pretty cool too, because it's in a TSR product and that it feels weird, you know, like you don't expect like that Warhammer approach in a D&D book.
Well, I love it when D&D gets weird. And this was another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They can find me every day on Instagram at Vintage RPG, where I'm posting things about things like the Fiend Folio and photos of me drinking tea sometimes. It's weird.
You do post occasional photos that are not of you, so that's neat. It's kind of off-putting because there's so much RPG excellence, and then here's my teacup.
Yeah, and some oranges. You have to have healthy snacks when you're running a game.
Variety is the spice of life. You can find me on the Twitter at John McGuire RPG. Heck, I changed all my social media handles. I am now at John McGuire RPG on Twitter and on Instagram, where you'll find pictures of my day-to-day life and other adventures. You could also check out our Patreon, patreon.com/vintagerpg. Early release episodes. We've got a behind-the-scenes look at Stu's book. We've got a behind-the-scenes look at my RPGs that I'm writing, and we've got a killer Discord community that we'd love for you to be a part of, patreon.com/vintagerpg. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.